Welcome to the Conservative Coalition. I'm Cody with my co-host Philip.
Howdy.
And my fellow co-host Connor, who is currently on audio.
Hello.
Today we'll be talking about Crazy Cortez, delving deep into exactly how out of touch with the world she really is. While we're at it, please make sure to smash that like button and caress that subscribe button. And if you're feeling generous, you can also head to our Patreon at Conservative CLN and donate to keep the content fresh and deep fried like true Americans.
Yes. We need your money, people. We need your support. We want to keep doing these episodes. We want to turn this into our career. We want to pay Connor. He needs some money. And
LOL. That is funny.
Our son needs to eat.
Praise the Lord, we need your money. We need your support, people.
Amen.
You guys are editing that out, right?
No.
Not a chance.
Yeah. Anyway,
we have a non-believer.
In our midst.
Cue the diminished chords, right? Anyway,
Gotta get that organ playing in the background.
the organ. I can actually see it playing in the background. Let's go.
Yeah.
Okay. Whatever.
Oh, geez, that's loud.
All right. In all seriousness, the Democratic Party has a new leader, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she won the Democratic primary, New York's 14th congressional district. She is the definition of globalism. She is the definition of a democratic socialist. And I hate to say it, she's ill-informed. She's terrible. But she's beautiful, and she could be my future wife.
She's stupid, dude. Stop.
Yeah.
She's dumb. She wouldn't even know like which ring goes on which finger, like whatever. Anyway,
we want to show you a recent interview that she did with Trevor Noah of The Daily Show, who we all used to be fans of until Trevor took over from Jon Stewart. In the interview, she was asked how she will pay for her agenda that you're going to see. Let's watch the video and see her response.
15% tax rate. If corporations paid, if we reversed the tax bill, but raised our corporate tax rate to 28%, which is not even as high as it was before.
Right.
If we do those two things and also close some of those loopholes, that's $2 trillion right there. That's $2 trillion in 10 years. And it's one of the wide estimates is that it's going to take $3 to $4 trillion to transition us to a 100% renewable energy economy. So we got $2 trillion from folks paying their fair share, which they were not paying before the Trump tax bill.
Right.
They weren't paying that before the Trump tax bill. If we get people to pay their fair share, that's $2 trillion in 10 years. Now, if we implement a carbon tax on top of that, so that we can transition and financially incentivize people away from fossil fuels. If we implement a carbon tax, that's an additional amount of a large amount of revenue that we can have. And then the last key, which is extremely, extremely important, is reprioritization. Just last year, we gave the military a $700 billion budget increase, which they didn't even ask for. They're like, we don't want another fighter jet. They're like, don't give us another nuclear bomb. You know?
Right.
They didn't even ask for it, and we gave it to them. And so
there we go, Vicious Cortez. All right. So there you have it, folks. That's her agenda. We're going to deconstruct all her points, and we're going to tell you the facts. And we're not going to make policies and arguments based off feelings, because that's never going to get anywhere. So, gentlemen, let's do it. So, she wants to say if people pay their fair share. What I want to ask is, how are people not paying their fair share? The top % of income earners pay most of the taxes in the country. The poor pay little to none. I don't want to lose 30, well, now it's going to be less, but before we were paying rich people were paying 30% or more of their income.
Yeah, 33%.
Yeah, and that's totally not fair. You work hard for your money. We all do. And I don't want the government taking it and giving it away for stupid programs and ridiculous spending. And thank God the GOP passed the tax cuts, because we're all going to see more money. And we'll get into that point later. And she wants to say a carbon tax. Well, we've seen under Obama that putting taxes on energy uses ends up hurting the poor. And this happened in Mexico when they tried to push clean energy, where they tried to promote solar, and then people weren't able to heat their homes, and that was terrible. That's the basic necessities that you need to survive. You need electricity, you need running water, and the rest is up to you. And I'm going to pull up an article that goes more into this, that pretty much proves her wrong, from Stanford University. Let me go ahead and bring that up right here. Stanford says, Stanford research finds carbon regulation burden heaviest on the poor. I encourage you to read this. The link is in the address bar there. And the reason is that companies ultimately pass on those costs to people, us, the customer. For the poor, basic necessities take up bigger chunks of their budget than for the rich. So you put this tax on, people are going to have less money to spend on food, for example. And maybe that Starbucks coffee if they have just enough money left over.
Ugh.
We shouldn't criticize people for wanting to drink coffee once in a while. I hate that argument.
I mean, unless you're Connor, then you get reparations. So
I think I'm supposed to just like ignore and just like let you say that,
Right.
and laugh at it. So I'm gonna do that. Ha 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 ha. Anyway, so
going into the article more, Charles Kostad, senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, says that households in the lowest income group pay as a percent of income more than twice that of what households in the highest 10% of income distribution pay. So yes, stop hurting the poor with your stupid policies that try to push energy reduction. Good example. Fox News had this opinion article on the effects of us pulling out of the Paris Accord. And long story short, we're doing great. We're doing way better than a lot of the countries that are currently in the Paris Accord. And the reason for that was because we're utilizing clean energy, natural gas. We're using natural gas, and we're not relying much on renewables. Why? Because they're more expensive. And also, it's cheaper to use the natural gas than it is that. And therefore, we are having a reduction in our greenhouse gases, and we're thriving without having to appear to some globalist agenda to the Paris Accord. We don't need other countries telling us what to do because we're doing it far better on our own.
and we're actually keeping our own promises.
Exactly. MAGA.
So, and to put it in perspective for some of the viewers at home that a lot of people can relate to directly, who owns an older vehicle? Who bought a vehicle that's used? Yeah, guess what? Carbon emissions, you get taxed based on the emission that your car has. So the lower ends of the tax bracket can't always afford to buy the brand new Prius with, zero emissions. You get a 10-year-old truck or something like that. And yeah, you pay a lot of taxes in that for carbon emissions. These taxes, this bill that they would want to pass through, would increase even further what you're paying every year for your carbon emissions on your vehicle. And it's not a small amount either. If you're paying $50 for it now, you're going to be paying almost $90 if they pass this.
And it's less green to buy new vehicles. It's better to reuse the vehicles that we have for long periods of time than to keep buying vehicles.
Yep.
All right, let's get into her next point.
So the next point she made was military reprioritization. She said just last year we gave the military a $700 billion budget increase, which they didn't even ask for. Well, of course they didn't ask for it. They don't have to ask for it. We pay the contractors who make the stuff for the military. We pay the military all of their wages. Every year, the value of the dollar bill goes down a little bit due to inflation. So to change that, we increase how much we give the military. We also have more people currently in the military than we did during the Obama administration because he cut more than 30% of our military out of active duty. now that we have more people back in and our forces are a whole lot bigger, we need to pay those people. And again, that also accounts for gear, ammunition, making sure that our defenses are up to date, and protecting our country. And by the way, that $700 billion budget was for 2018 and 2019. It's not a single year. It's going between 2 fiscal years. So when she tries to argue that $700 billion went to the military, it's kind of important that we do that. A militaryless nation is a defenseless nation. We need to be paying our military. And $700 billion is nowhere near as much of an increase as we're used to seeing, partially because that the GOP has done a very good job of increasing our market values, which means the overall inflation of money is less this year than it has during the 5 years I was in the service.
Yeah, and then also the generals were complaining that readiness was a huge factor. We weren't going to be ready for the next big event. So we need to invest in our military. They keep us safe. And we also have to protect Canada and Europe.
I mean, half the world.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, with looming threats like North Korea, and now maybe Russia, looking at how they've been acting recently, and still dealing with Syria, still dealing with Iraq and Afghanistan, still protecting Palestine. Yeah, we've got people all over the world right now, in half of modern countries and a lot of third world countries as well.
Yeah, and we have to bolster our military so we don't look incredibly weak to other nations. Which it's incredibly hilarious how a lot of isolationists tout the idea of trying to radically defund our military, which I understand the sentiment to a certain degree, but on the same token, it really doesn't make too much logical sense to me. Because like the best way to avoid any sorts of altercation, whether it's in like a personal thing or let's say a geopolitical thing, is trying to present yourself as the person who's going to win if you try to attack me in the first place. And by constantly, and this is a relatively simplified, let's say, response to it, but trying to radically fund our military, or not radically, but just appropriately fund our military, it causes other countries to look at us and say, okay, America is not someone in whom we should actually try to go and attack. And then that actually avoids a tremendous amount of war that would happen if we radically were intersectionalist and have like not intersectionalist, but isolationist, and we have like an event or a situation that's akin to World War II or World War I, both times actually, where America was incredibly isolationist. So,
I mean, to put it in perspective, you muzzle a bulldog, the home invader's not going to be afraid of the bulldog. Instead, you put a rocket launcher on its back, that home invader is going to be a little bit terrified of that bulldog. And that's kind of the idea. We'd rather have other countries respect us out of fear for our military might than actually have to use our military might.
All right, let's go over her next crazy statement on free education and healthcare.
Yeah, free healthcare and education. It doesn't really make too much sense. And the reason why it doesn't really make too much sense on both fronts, on healthcare and education. Well, on healthcare, there are a lot of different reasons why, but one of the most imperative reason I feel is the fact that you can't actually have free healthcare without having two of these three different sects. And these three different sects are affordability, quality, and universality. If you have affordability and you have quality, well, you're not going to have universality. If you have quality and you have universality, you're not going to have affordability. And if you have affordability and universality, you're not going to have quality. But I think the more imperative point as to why free healthcare won't work is because of the exorbitantly high tax rates. It's estimated because Bernie Sanders just talked about recently of having like this giant Medicare for all program that would cost almost up to $32 trillion, which is nearly twice the amount of gross domestic product America produces in a year. And education is also just incredibly terrible. I mean, it's a terrible idea. Education is because like we spend a dramatic amount on education already. Like the amount of money we spent on education ever since the 60s has risen like almost 100%, 200%, I think. And the actual test scores, whether it be in math or science or reading, have stagnated. The problem with education is not the fact that it's underfunded, which is a stupid idea. The problem is that the whole entire system itself is incredibly flawed. And it's idiotic to me how Democrats like Ocasio-Cortez, Republicans or conservatives don't really care too much about children, if they're propagating wanting to radically fund a system that literally causes children to commit panic attacks or to commit suicide because of like incredibly terrible and standardized Common Core standards. You know, the education system is incredibly it's flawed from the root of it. And I don't think that giving it more money and radically funding it is going to help any of the issues in which we see today.
Exactly, and what I want to make a point about is if everybody has a college degree, then what is the value of the college degrees?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's kind of like saying if everybody's unique, then no one's unique.
Yeah,
and unfortunately, as Connor stated earlier, yes, you can only have two of the three: affordability, quality, or universality. The problem with that is if the government gets control of it, you automatically lose an extra one. So you can only have one of the three at that point because it's not going to be quality and it's not going to be affordable. $32 trillion, yeah, that's almost twice what our national deficit was when Barack Obama got out of office. So,
Yeah,
and that's been on the rise for 150 years. Now you're talking about trying to provide that every single year. It's just not going to happen. It's not realistic.
We're going to have to radically raise tax rates if you want to do that, and that's probably not going to pay for it. I mean, Denmark has 60% tax rates. Switzerland, I think, has like a max of 40%. Some places low as 20, high as 40. And those are places with ethnically homogenous populations. Incredibly small populations as well. So like this idea, this fantasy that a lot of people had that we're just going to be able to provide healthcare to everyone is just untrue.
Let's look at quality really quick in other countries that are poster childs for this socialized healthcare, shall we? So, from what I spoke to people in other countries, I've done my research, and basically, socialized healthcare is great for minor things like sickness, flu, and basic care. But when it comes to when you really need it, such as breaking a leg or any surgeries, your care is rationed, long waiting lists, shortages in doctors, and poor quality in care. So you can't tell me that throwing the government into this and controlling everything is going to be the answer.
Yeah, I mean, according to like the Jerusalem Post, I think about a couple months ago, they reported about almost 1,000 doctors last year have fled from Israel because of the socialized system in which they have, because they're being underpaid. They're coming to countries like America, which have our healthcare system is in fact flawed. I don't want any person on the opposite side thinking that we don't think it's flawed. It is incredibly flawed.
Yes.
But it's still better because we have a freer market, and America does import because of the free market we have. Whether it's the somewhat free market we have in the pharmaceutical industry, we do develop a tremendous amount of drugs that are shipped all across the nation, or all across the world rather. And the other countries do not, in fact, do because they don't have as a free market as America does, specifically in the development of drugs and the development of certain treatment protocols like laser eye surgery, which has drastically decreased ever since I think the 80s.
Yes, let's talk about why that decreased significantly. The unregulated and competition.
Exactly, and that's happened with everything.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be just PRK, and now we have two different kinds of laser eye surgery. One of them is all done by machine. I've been thinking about getting it myself. It's $150 an eye with insurance. That's insanely cheap. You're talking about one of the most fragile portions of your body that are also the most important portions of your body, and it's super cheap. And I have never heard any kind of horror stories personally with someone who's gotten LASIK. I do want to point out, and I was thinking about this earlier today, there is a really interesting fact that I don't think a lot of people have considered yet with the poster childs like Denmark, like Canada, and other places like that with this socialist healthcare. How many factories do they have? How many mine shafts do they work? How many oil rigs do they have? How many steel factories? How many construction teams? Not a lot. These are the most dangerous jobs in the world, and they have next to zero. Their workplace injury rates are below average levels for anywhere in the world, and they're about a fifth of what is in the United States because they don't have jobs like that. We do it all, and we ship it over to them, or it's done in China or Japan and other places like that. And yeah, so their need for critical health care, like emergency rooms, like quick response aid, is nowhere near as high as places in the United States. So that is a cost that people do not factor in because helicopter rides to the hospital, they ain't cheap.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and one factor, and I think I talked about this on the last podcast, one factor in which I think that people forget to understand about these so-called pseudo-socialist countries is that they're, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because, like, people may ask, well, I mean, if America's an incredibly prosperous and rich country, has the largest GDP in the entire world, then why aren't we able to pay for these programs? Now, despite the fact that I mentioned earlier that it'll cost $32 trillion, which is, again, twice the amount of our GDP, one of the reasons in which that these countries are able to pay for it in very large quotations is because of the fact they're not socialist countries. Their government expenditure is incredibly high, but their economic freedom, according to the Fraser Institute, is also incredibly high. These Nordic countries like Switzerland and Denmark and Norway, their economic freedom is higher than America's. You know, so they're able to generate a tremendous amount of profit to, in fact, tax in their incredibly low and ethnically homogenous countries. That's one other point that I'd like to share.
Mm-hmm. Great. Let's get into the next one. This is more recent. She went on Twitter and kind of had a thought, if you can call it that. She had some things to say.
A brain fart.
Let me go pull it up here.
I mean, brain farts are accidents. I'm pretty sure this was on purpose.
Yeah. Here we go. If you can hopefully see that. Let's go ahead and read what Ms. Cortez said. The GOP is weak on fighting for working class Americans, weak on crime, weak on equal rights, weak on national security, weak on rejecting racism, weak on moral courage, weak on family values. So yeah, I'd say this is a representative choice of their values.
And this was in response to her being in a bad mood because the Republicans kept the majority of the House through the midterm.
Wow.
All right, guys, if you will allow me, I'm going to dive into the first point on weak on fighting for working class Americans.
Be my guest.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. First of all, the Trump administration has used tariffs to leverage actions out of other nations that are positive for the United States. Basically, the United States was treated unfairly in trade. Canada, for example, there was a 200 to 300% markup on dairy products. China's been unfair. The EU's been unfair. He's fighting to protect our jobs here. He wants us to prosper. No other president would have the balls to fight for the American worker like this. You know how they would want to fight for the American worker? More government handouts, and that's despicable. Also, some China tariffs have hurt the U.S. worker, but he is making progress, like in Europe. Trump has made some mistakes, but it's kind of working itself out. Europe, he just met with them recently. And guess what? They're going to start taking our soybeans and probably more. He's fixing this terrible problem. And I don't know if y'all remember, not too long ago, we had a massive tax cut that benefited 80% of the workers in this country. I myself got a $300 a month raise. Thank you. Make America great again.
I got an extra $1,000 a month or a year or so back on my taxes.
And I got nothing because I'm 17.
You'll never enjoy the fruits of the tax cut. And also, let's dive into the employment rate. 3.9% is the unemployment rate as of today. The date's in the video. Check it out. And also, historic low Hispanic and Black unemployment. Trump cares about everyone in this country and he wants to see them thrive. Equality of opportunity, not outcomes.
And speaking of low unemployment rates, one of the biggest problems with having a high unemployment rate, it kind of helps produce crime. When people can't make a decent wage going to work every day, they have to turn to alternative modes of getting money to feed themselves, their family, and so on. Which brings us to her next point, which is the GOP is weak on crime. This is the same group, the same current administration, who has put into motion legislature for harsher punishment against drug-related crimes. So if you are caught selling, if you are a distributor, if you are running a meth lab, Republicans are pushing for the death penalty for people who commit those crimes. Because why am I going to send you to prison for 15 years on the taxpayer's dime when you've probably killed at least 100 people with your nasty drugs? The left claims racism against every minority criminal that gets prosecuted, such as in the Zimmerman case. The left has constantly told us that we need to be more tolerant, even towards people like pedophiles in California. But yet we are the ones who are weak on crime. I mean, I can't quite understand exactly how you can get that so twisted. Republicans have always been a lot more harsh. Just as an overall perspective, Republicans are for the death penalty for all severe crimes. If you have raped someone, if you had killed someone, if you are a terrorist, you need to be put down. You are a danger to society, and you're not going to live in a cozy cell with 3 squares a day. You need to be put down. You're an animal, which is what we're for. But yet the left is always the one trying to legalize a lot of the things that are crimes or get lower punishments for people who commit those crimes. And again, perfect example with cases like the Zimmerman case, where it was a Spanish gentleman, who's not even white, I think he was a Puerto Rican, who defended himself with a gun. And because of the kid's social identity, because of his race, he was sent death threats. He had to be put into witness protection on multiple occasions because people were looking to try and kill him. This is not the right that's doing this. This would be the Democratic Party. So again, another perfect example. They defend Hillary Clinton when she was running for office. We have definitive proof that she sent more than 30,000 emails from a classified computer to an unprotected third-party website. When I was in the military, if I had sent a cat GIF through my military email to my private email, I would have seen prison time, because that's breach of security. That's a top secret breach of security. She got away with it, but they are going to push for Trump to be impeached for collusion with Russia, which has zero proof, zero evidence, zero collaboration. So yeah, I don't understand how they're chasing these fantasies. And for her to say that we're weak on crime is kind of like me saying that fire hoses don't have water in them.
Yeah, and one other point that I'd like to make about this, and that I think Republicans and Democrats tend to ignore, but I think Democrats wholesale they do tremendously, is like the cultural reasons as to which crime occurs. I mean, there are a lot of other reasons as to why crime occurs. Relative poverty is one of the reasons as to why crime occurs. But one of the biggest reasons why crime occurs, specifically in urbanized neighborhoods, is because of the culture that is in fact propagated in the said neighborhood, right? The music and the manner of speech, the respect that one has toward their brethren, the communal gatherings in which the culture in fact has, the culture in which it in fact celebrates. And I know this from experience. It doesn't propagate, let's say, incredibly nice, constructive, relatively objective Judeo-Christian values, right? It's this continual competitive culture insofar as gang culture that's incredibly prevalent amongst African Americans in urbanized inner city neighborhoods in places like Chicago or Baltimore. The fact of the matter is that culture leads a heck of a lot to crime. And if you're a Republican, any person, mind you, who has the audacity to point that out, you're immediately labeled a racist, a person who doesn't understand, or you don't actually want to solve the root of the issue. How dare you? Like, the reason why this in fact happens isn't because of the fact that these individual people make their own individual decisions. No, it's because they're subject to some idealistic oppression from historical oppression that causes them to make their own individual choices in the current day, which is completely illogical, right? So if Democrats really actually, I'm not going to say that, I think that's too strong of a point to make, but the point that I'm trying to make is this: cultural reasons have something to do with crime in this country. They do, and Democrats conveniently always ignore that because they know that those same people who in fact commit those things to a certain degree are the same people who are going to place this specific Democrat on their ballot when fall comes around. So,
I mean, we're sitting here talking about the Democratic nominee and how little information and how little she is in touch with reality. Kind of brings to mind an event that happened earlier today with Philip and I on our Twitter page. If you haven't followed us already, you should. Twitter, what is it?
Conservative CLN.
Thank you. So, yeah, we were speaking with a Democratic a state representative earlier today, and I thought we were having a somewhat decent conversation. I mean, she kept telling us to look at our history, that we didn't know anything about our history, and she sounded a lot like the Young Turks. But yeah, I mean, we came back, we gave solid points, we kind of sourced our information. We're very straightforward, no cursing, no put downs. I mean, she did to us several times. But when she realized she couldn't win, she blocked my personal account and our Conservative Coalition Twitter page. And we have since reposted this series of tweets. But after blocking us, she decided to get back on her own page and say that we were paid Russian bots.
that is not true. Are you serious?
I mean, we're sitting here talking right now. I'm not Russian. I'm Irish. So, and
as far as from Russian you can get. So,
yeah, and I mean, I can't even do the robot. Like, I can't dance. Like, it. So
I can somewhat, but that's not even a point.
Yeah, it kind of just goes to show that the left is always willing, the mainstream left is always willing to jump up and say, you're wrong, you're evil, you're racist, you're a liar, until you bring valid information and proper statistics and analytic results to the table and show that you're an intelligent, quantifiable human being, and then they have to turn around and block you. And again, this is a representative of a state who
my state.
Yeah, who turned around and blocked us because we disagreed with her position on the union and we wanted to have a discussion with her about it.
And she didn't even watch the damn video. She just responded blindly.
Did you send her like the last video about the unions?
Yeah, so how this all started was it was a paid tweet to promote our video. She just read the headline and like, no, unions are good for me all my life. And then I'm like, no. And Cody's like, no. Then she clicked the block button and followed by delete.
Wow. Oh, I mean,
yeah, I mean, apparently a 25-year-old Marine Corps vet and I'm just going to say you're 29, Philip,
sure.
Air Force vet, managed to send a grown woman who is trying to have a career in politics and is a state representative running for her safe space to play with her Play-Doh. I really wish, and if you are on the left and you're watching this show right now, please come to our Twitter page, come talk to us. We would love to have individuals on the show that can have an intellectual conversation with us. We're not looking to argue. We really do want to hear what the other side has to say and really understand both sides of it and see that the left and the right sides of the aisle can come together and can get along, instead of having us have to do stuff like this where, you know, every single point that Ms. Cortez has made has just been completely wrong, and now we have to spend our time to try to correct her errors.
Yeah, so that argument was on Twitter today, and I just want to point out that we're always respectful, and we're always nice, and we want to engage in facts, not feelings. Couple other videos we made of abortion and debating unions, that was all done at a bar. Not the perfect place to have a political discussion, but always respectful and nice and wanting to engage in intellectual debate. But the left always embraces their feelings, and they get butthurt, and everything gets ugly. But we will not do that to you. We respect the intellectual mind.
And don't get me wrong, we may make a joke or two. You're more than welcome as well. It's all in good fun. But no, none of us will ever sit there and berate you unless you start it. And in which case, I am very practiced at ending those kinds of arguments. So speaking of crime and politics, it's kind of sad how often those two are intermixed. Another point that she made in her tweet and live on national television was that our current GOP administration is weak on national security. Now, again, I cannot quite grasp the ability to be this Hippocratic and not see the fallacy in your own logic. The Republicans have taken a hard and firm stance and planted our feet against illegal immigration. We want harder punishments for crimes overall. And while we're doing this, the left is comparing ICE to terrorism and calling for illegal immigrants to be hailed as saints and heroes. They're forming sanctuary cities, which by all rights are a national security threat in itself. These are entire cities and states that are refusing to abide by federal laws. So when they say we're weak on national security here in our own lands, if we're weak in our national security, it's because they've been fighting us every single step of the way with every single thing that we try to do. There are several cities here in the United States that the left has been trying to help push for Sharia law for the Muslim immigrants that have come here through other countries. Hell, they want to give actual Muslim terrorists a pass. The last two terrorist attacks, they have gone out and said, well, this isn't a representation of the Muslim people. This isn't a representation of their religion. This is not a representation of anything except for poor, disenfranchised people from the Far East. And it's just not true. We've seen time and time again how violent they are overall. And barring that, we have wanted to pass temporary travel bans against countries who are known to support terrorists, who are known to give money to terrorists, who are known to be run by terrorists, who have openly come out and said that we are sending terrorists from these countries to the U.S. to commit acts of terrorism. And which group is the one that was fighting that legislation? Which group was the one who was saying that it was incredibly racist and inconsiderate and terrible and Nazi-like of us to want to secure our borders from those countries? And yes, that also includes Mexico. That also includes other countries that border with us as well, such as Canada. The main difference is that most Canadians are illegally immigrating into this country in the first place, and the few that aren't joining crime syndicates. They're not joining gangs. They're not going out and raping and killing and pillaging people while getting on the government toll of the process. So, yeah, when they say that we're weak on national security, we've been trying our hardest to secure our borders and protect our country. If we have not been able to do so to the left's purview, the only fault that it lies with is the left.
Mhm.
Because if we had been able to pass even half of the legislature we've been trying to, the last several attacks could have been prevented. A whole lot of the illegal immigration could have been prevented. When it comes to fighting foreign wars, the left pulling out most of our troops at a very critical time in Iraq and Afghanistan, allowing the rise for yet another terrorist nation. If these things had not happened, there would not be any more of this terrorism going on, especially here in the United States.
Mhm.
That's why several other countries are actually starting to close their borders to the refugees that are coming through, because they're coming through and blowing themselves up with the local populace.
Yeah.
So, no, we are not weak on national security. National security is weak thanks to people like her.
Exactly. You know, and I think, I think that the next point that that Cortez makes, sort of kind of, it's because it's sort of kind of weird to a certain degree. And the reason why it's weird, because she says that Republicans have a lack of moral courage, which I'll get into that just like a tiny bit later. But it's weird because she says on one point that we are weak on national security. And then she says that we have a lack of moral courage. Now, the only reason I feel like anyone would be weak on national security is because they're overtly compassionate, right? To a certain, like how a lot of isolationist leftists are. They're trying to act in this hyper compassionism, and it's incredibly disenfranchising. It doesn't work, as you said. The only reason why a lot of the legislation has not passed is because of people like her, because of their hyper-compassionism. So it's difficult. You can't have it both ways. You can't accuse Republicans of being weak on national security, and the only reason of that being compassionate akin to Democrats, and then also say that we don't have any moral courage. That's hypocritical. Now, then again, you have both things, and the reason why we have both things, we have moral courage and we're incredibly stuck on national security. The difficulty in explaining this is because the idea of moral courageousness is it's vague, and even if it did have a discernible meaning, it is incredibly stupid when it comes to applying it to politics. Now, there's two arguments we can make. You can say that, okay, well, when it comes to politics, we're only really supposed to focus on facts, not feelings, because if you focus too much on one individual's feelings and determine policy based on that, that's incredibly selfish. It doesn't actually help anybody, because if you have actual statistical fact, then that can permeate throughout the populace, right? If we say that, okay, well, a certain number of African Americans commit this statistically or disproportionately represented when it comes to crime in this country, that is objectively true, right? By using the actual stats. Whereas if we go and give try to create policy on the basis in which, okay, well, African Americans, there's this form of let's say institutional oppression that it goes and oppresses them, and we try to base policy on that. That's not going to cause anything to actually change, because we're not going to do anything about it, because we see it as an outgrowth of institutional oppression and not just facts. Now, insofar as the GOP gives more to charity, and we also tip more. According to a study by MIT, we do in fact give more to charity. You'll hear people say that's because we give more money to religious institutions, which is perfectly fine, mind you. And I see no reason as to why this delineates the point. But yes, we do give more to charity, and that's out of a drive of compassion a lot of conservatives have. We don't actually see the government as the father, right, of us, trying to coddle us and take care of us and provide social programs and heavily subsidize them. We see our own personal responsibility, not some impersonal responsibility, some collectively designed institution out there trying to help people know we want to get it faster through charity. And it does get done efficient and faster through charity. And also it's better because it's like an individual thing in which you can actually go in and say. By saying that, I mean with welfare, for instance, right? Or with food stamps. Okay, you're giving them food and you're giving them money, okay? But you don't know these people. The whole entire purpose of proper charity, of morally just charity, is giving something to someone for a specific design purpose. All right. You don't give money to some random homeless person on the street all the time. Why? Because your $5 is better spent on whatever you want to buy in comparison to what the homeless person wants to buy, because that person actually knew how to spend money or be able to use money, they wouldn't be homeless. Right. We give charity for a designed, limited purpose so that person can raise out of that poverty in the most economically free society in the history of the world. And by mandating government to do such a thing, that's more morally idiotic and insipid, by mandating government to do it, because you're taking the power out of the individual that's use their money for the specific purpose in which they want to do, to help somebody, some unseen person in whom you don't know, through charity. Right.
It's the difference between giving of your own free will for something you think worthy of your hard-earned money and your attention, as opposed to appropriation of your hard-earned money to whatever they want to do with it.
Exactly. And, and one more point I'd like to make. Now, the Republican Party was founded on pretty constitutional basis, right? We were founded as, we were called the Republicans for a very specific reason, a very specific historical reason. To really understand the Republican ethos, all you really have to do is read, let's say, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bible to a certain degree, right? So, and the reason why I bring this up is because one of the philosophies that do undergird our Constitution heavily, which is seen throughout the Declaration of Independence, the influence of John Locke on people like Thomas Jefferson, the inalienable right to life, liberty, and property, right? And morally just and courageous ideal that has ever been invented in the history of mankind. This idea that every single person has an inalienable right to life, liberty, and property, right? And the government should not have any place in infringing on those rights, unless the person sanctifies those rights for the harm and the cessation of one's life, or another's life rather. That's an incredible new and fantastic discovery. And the Republican Party was a party that was founded on trying to propagate these philosophical ideas. And the reason why it's more egalitarian than, let's say, Marxist egalitarianism, which is the idea that everyone is equal innately, right? And that the government government's place is trying to make sure that everyone actually stays in their equal boundaries and bases. The reason why this is more, let's say, morally courageous, as Cortez would say, is because this ideal understands that every single person is in fact an individual. It is not your job to go and change somebody else. It is not your job to force government to change somebody else because you want society to be planned in a certain fashion. If we let the spontaneous order of the market or social sphere sort of kind of do their work and provide, let's say, an ethical substructure to concretize that can cause society to function. And we see that through America, through the history of America, the beauty of America, whether it be in an economic sense, but also in the promulgation of incredibly rich and new ideas that other countries have not found historically. And I feel like people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez don't understand that. They don't. They view Republicans in America as a whole as this insipid evil on society, and don't understand that American Lockean egalitarian values are some of the most altruistic and courageous, as she would say, values, because they created a society where me and you, or me and like an opposing leftist, are able to have a conversation, an actual substantive conversation, without some governmental force discriminating against one or the other because they disagree with us. That's an incredibly new, fantastic idea that's only been around for the past 300 years. So.
Beautifully said, man. Beautifully said. Now, Ms. Cortez says that the GOP is weak on family values and weak on equal rights, and that's complete BS. The Republican Party is the party of family values. They know the secret to escaping poverty. But the Democrats just want to make you go on welfare and be dependent on the state. What does the GOP preach? Marriage. If you want to be successful, you need to be married.
And before you have kids.
Yes, before. You need to have a high school education. And you need to work. If you follow those simple things, you will have a high chance of escaping poverty in your adult life. You can make it. You can have a great life for yourself. Oh, God, the next one. Abortion. GOP wants to protect your family. They want families to grow. We want to populate the earth. Why should the liberals want to kill babies?
Mm-hmm.
We have conservative judges now that are promoting traditional family values. They're defunding. Trump is defunding Planned Parenthood by removing a title like spending in the federal government. Taxpayers no longer have to subsidize abortions, which is great. It's a reduction of the government.
Mm-hmm.
Government's getting smaller, folks. Embrace it. And let's go on to equal rights a bit.
But before you do, I just want to point out, I think the only time I've ever seen a man in power give up power by using his power to do so was while Trump was in office. He has not only purposely limited his own powers, but he has given a lot of his direct power back to the people. So,
yeah, and that's incredibly important. I feel like a lot of leftists or liberals who see this will sit there and say, well, will say that, we'll use that as an excuse to sit there and say, well, he's not actually trying to fight these issues. Like they'll sit there and they'll say, well, because he's radically defunding Planned Parenthood, they don't like Republicans. He doesn't want to support women, right? Mm-hmm. Women's healthcare, women's rights. And I feel like that's an incredibly idiotic idea. And it's for the reason which I was explaining before, because if logically speaking, the best way in order to have the best circumstance for an individual group of people, right, or a collective group of people, is by trying to, not by mandating the government to be the sole proprietor of a specific ideal. The reason why that doesn't work is because that ideal never gets criticized. It never actually changes. If a gun is sitting at the hill aiming at people, saying that if you in fact violate any of these certain precepts I've put down, then you will in fact get shot. That's not the best way for trying to come up with new and brand new solutions for certain things which we find a problem toward. Right. The best way of trying to actually find that is by trying to place these specific ideals into a free market of ideal exchange. So the best ideas that make the most logical sense amongst everybody, which is the most altruistic thing we can in fact do, win out and start companies and make profits and help more people. This idea that government is the reason, is the way in which we can actually solve issues is incredibly idiotic, because like you're not trying to promote evolution. You're trying to stagnate. That's what the government does. It stagnates because there is no allowance for any competition to in fact rectify any issues in which the government in fact has. So
yeah, it's true. And now, weak on equal rights. Under the Trump administration, we've seen a true example of systemic racism that the left claims exists everywhere and suppressing people.
The racism ghost.
He ended racial discrimination guidelines that Obama put in place that allowed colleges to discriminate against applicants based on their race. Asians were heavily discriminated against at Harvard University. And he put in policies to protect Asian students so they can actually attend this university. And that's pretty much the only one of the few, if only, examples of systemic racism in this country. Trump is not a racist. He wants everyone to have the opportunity to succeed.
okay, so her next point was that the GOP was weak on rejecting racism, which this is from multiple perspectives, this is incredibly, like, this just doesn't really make too much logical sense, honestly. From a historical perspective, the Republican Party has been the party of with the anti-slavery party. It was the party for egalitarian rights amongst African Americans. I can remember when the Republican list, I can't remember it, but obviously, historically, S. Grant actually put troops on the ground to protect African American communities right after slavery during the time of Reconstruction, because the Democratic control, let's say, first wave of the Ku Klux Klan was threatening to destroy these communities. This happened in a specific community, I think in Oklahoma, called Greenwood. But nevertheless, the Republican Party has always been the party, historically, of the anti-slavery and the pro-African American equal rights party. And I think people sort of kind of get this defenestrated view of it because of things like the switch that they say that happens, the Southern strategy, which is a complete, utter lie. It's 100% lie. The reason why the South turned red was because a lot of people who lived, Republicans who lived in the North, lost a lot of their manufacturing and automotive jobs, like in places like, Gary over in Ohio, and moved down south and brought their values and their votes with them. And they cite people like Barry Goldwater. That's not necessarily true. Barry Goldwater was not like this radically racist Republican that voted against the Civil Rights Act. He did that because the Civil Rights Act innately is just not it's a good piece for its time, but it also forces certain industries to in fact serve everyone, which is anti-constitutionalist. And we can get into that a bit more later, but suffice it to say, the GOP has always been the party of trying to promote equal rights for everybody, right? And the Democrats have always been the party of trying to play this intersectionalist game, whether it be in eugenicism, right, during the early 20th century, or the contemporary intersectionalism a lot of leftist Democrats like to play. It's the same thing. White privilege, the idea that a white person innately has some unattainable privilege that African Americans do not in fact have, is similar to, let's say, Margaret Sanger spouting ideals about how African Americans are innately inferior on a biological sense. It's just that during that time, the zeitgeist of the 40s was in fact more focused on trying to delineate differences through genetical means, right? Whereas now, it's the zeitgeist of the current era is the idea of social justice. And all we do is, if you actually replace the idea of victimization of the oppression hierarchy that's corroborated in the intersectional ideals with eugenicism of the last of the early 20th century, you get the same exact result and the same exact means, right? And people say, well, they're different. It isn't different. The reason why it's different is because they're both unfounded, right? This whole entire idea of institutional oppression amongst African Americans is in fact a myth. It does not exist, right? Insofar as now it doesn't, especially now where African Americans are not subject to any discriminatory laws that any other person is in fact not subject to. We're just as equal as any other individual. And in the same fashion as in early 20th century eugenicism, those findings, those demographic and those biological findings amongst African Americans, causing the disproportionate, the actually incorrect, disproportionate relationships we saw back then, that was also incredibly untrue. So the whole entire basis of the point is that historically, Democrats have always been the party trying to play the victim narrative when it comes to talking about specific minorities, right? So to sit there and say that the GOP is the party that's rejecting racism, if any party nowadays, and I say this with utmost honesty, I don't necessarily disagree with this. I think that the Democrat Party has been the historical party of actually corroborating ideals of racism, not in their tangible speech, not in the speech in which they actually talk about. A lot of Democrats are incredibly compassionate, but it's in the ideas in which they actually corroborate this victimizational narrative, which causes people of the said oppressed hierarchies to feel as if the entire universe in which they should go out there and attack, they cannot attack because there's like this insignificant, invisible ideal of institutional oppression constantly going against them. It's like African American culture, we have this thing called the talk, where parents tell their kids, they're incredibly young, 6 years old, that our country is designed to be against you. That's psychologically devastating for a child. And yet that's at the epitome of African American cultures, specifically in urbanized areas. And then we go and we complain as to why African Americans aren't doing that well. They're not doing that well because we have parents, idiotic parents, who are telling their children that the entire country, the most economically and socially free place in the entire world, is designed from the get-go to oppress them. That is not true. And the GOP, the Republican Party, historically has been the party that has tried to get rid of this fallacy. But nevertheless,
Amen, brother.
Oh God,
preach it, man. No, and you make a lot of good points to that, and you can even see it even besides when you're a young kid, with all of the things that you're told and all the things that you hear people say that, you know, white America is out to get you and everything like that. You can even see it in our adult workplaces. If you go to apply for college and you're a minority race, if you're Asian or Latino or African American,
exactly.
you are much more likely to get in, not because you have good scores, but
because of the fact
because of the color, because of the color of your skin, or because of your gender. They actually, the one race and gender that does not have any kind of externalities for colleges and workplaces to help them get into the workplace, to help them to get into college, are white males. So, and that's not something that the Republicans put into place, by the way.
Okay, so that point makes sense. And it actually connects back to the idea in which I was explaining earlier, a bit earlier actually, about the idea that I don't really think that Democrats are explicitly racist. I don't think that they're like akin to like let's say the mid-40s or the 30s or 20s Ku Klux Klan. Like I don't think they're explicitly racist in their demeanor, but I do think that they're ideologues. Let's say they're Marxist, philosophical basis. They're Marxist ways of thinking to a certain degree. Not every single liberal there is to exist, but a very large portion of them. It has a tendency to lean itself over to incredibly institutionalized discrepancies, right, once they get governmental power. And then when you see the effects of that over time, they have a tendency to go and explain that. And though they do actually blame that on past institutional oppressions in which the people, their forefathers in their specific party, in their thought catalog, are the people who in fact corroborated that ideal. Now, and to use as an example, like you mentioned, college affirmative action, there's an idea called misplacement theory. And misplacement theory is the idea that the reason why African-American males in particular are not graduating college at any exorbitantly higher rates in comparison to what they were before affirmative action was implemented, right, actually is tremendously lower. If you adjust it for the fact that people have been getting higher diplomas generally, on a statistical basis, the percentage rate is incredibly lower. The actual number isn't, but the percentage rate is. Now, and you would think that with this policy put in place, it wouldn't necessarily cause this, but it actually does. And the reason why it does is because you misplace people. You misplace African Americans who statistically do lower and score lower on standardized testing into environments that are not applicable to their needs. It's not that these people are dumber, they're just not, they're not equipped, they don't have the intellectual capacity to in fact handle an incredibly strenuous place like Harvard. Some individuals do, some individuals don't. But statistically, a large portion of African Americans don't. So when you put them in a place through affirmative action like Harvard, they're not going to be as successful and they're going to drop out of college. And because they don't have a college degree, and because the bachelor's degree is becoming the new high school diploma, because the diploma now is irrevocably useless because everyone has one, they're out of work. And that leads to the cycle of poverty. It may lead to it, but it does, in fact, lead to that cycle of poverty, which we see amongst African Americans. And then the Democrats would be the same people to blame that cycle of poverty on the institutional oppression that Republicans historically have inflicted on them, which is incredibly idiotic. It is hypocritical. So that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Connor. Folks, we cannot let the globalists win. We need a red wave. We need people who respect the Constitution, the laws. We need to take this country back. It's going in a great direction right now, and we cannot afford to have it lost to these globalists like Cortez. Trump's been working hard for you, for the country, and if we want Trump to be good in his second term and actually get reelected and push a nice constitutional agenda and deliver prosperity in this country, we need to make sure that Republicans are in power and that he gets reelected. Because if we cannot lose right now, we cannot afford to lose. We're winning the culture war. Things are getting better. And I pray every day that you'll help us get this country back and stay in the right direction. Connor, Cody, thank you guys. Great show. And I hope that people really understand the message that we're trying to deliver.
Stay American.